Well, as the 2024 campaign continues its march towards November, and it certainly appears as if we have our two candidates, Donald Trump will likely be the Republican nominee, and President Biden will be the likely Democratic nominee, unless something unforeseen happens. You're going to have an incumbent president going up against a guy who was the president before him. So it's an interesting dynamic. But anytime you have an incumbent president, there are often hurdles that need to be overcome. And joining us to talk about a forthcoming book that he wrote called Beat the Incumbent: Proven Strategies and Tactics to Win Elections is Dr. Luis Perron. He's got a really in-depth look at just what it means to what you need to do in order to overcome beating an incumbent president. Dr. Perron, thank you for coming on the DC Debrief. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
It's great to talk to you. And I think this is a unique election because, yes, you do have in Joe Biden an incumbent president. Certainly, based on the polling, based on some of the other numbers, he's a weakened incumbent president. But there are advantages that are inherent with the incumbency no matter what. But then on the other hand, you have Donald Trump, who was a former president. In a lot of ways, in the minds of a lot of Republican voters, they see him as the legitimate president, despite the fact he did not win the Electoral College or the popular vote. And so do you get the sense, Dr. Perron, that there's a little bit of a baked incumbency in Donald Trump's candidacy as well? Because it almost feels like you have incumbent versus incumbent.
Yes, absolutely. It is a sort of uncharted territory. It's a situation that we know maybe from congressional elections, when sometimes because of redistricting, there is an incumbent versus an incumbent. But at the national level, for a presidential race, this is really kind of a new situation where you have an incumbent versus an incumbent. And that's actually difficult and tricky for Donald Trump, because it makes it very easy for Joe Biden and the Democrats to make this a binary choice instead of a referenda on the incumbent, which usually incumbent races are. Usually elections with an incumbent are a referenda on the incumbent. And in this case, I think one of the challenges for Donald Trump is to make sure it stays a referenda on the incumbent.
And you certainly see that from especially Trump surrogates trying to continue to hammer out at inflation, some of the other aspects of the Biden presidency, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, some handling of foreign policy issues. Certainly, there are areas where the American people are unhappy with the incumbent. So this isn't like, say, in 2008, when you had in Barack Obama was a relatively strong incumbent going up against John McCain. How did Barack Obama? Actually, it was in 2008, Barack Obama and John McCain, neither of them were incumbents at that point. I apologize. So in 2008, both were running as first timers. But Barack Obama, you talk about in your book, painted John McCain as a Republican insider in the 2008 presidential election. How did he do that?
By really owning change, by claiming change and defending change. And I think that's one part I write about in the book, that actually McCain would have been quite well positioned to run sort of as a maverick. Actually, in political circles, he was known as a maverick. He could have been an independent messenger from George Bush, who the incumbent president at the time, who had become very unpopular. And what Obama and his team did very well is to really defend their territory change against McCain.
So let's look at some previous elections where you have an incumbent and look at some of the different scenarios there, because in the last election, Joe Biden was challenging the incumbent Donald Trump. So it was a role reversal from what we're seeing right now. How did Joe Biden manage to overcome the Donald Trump incumbency in 2020?
Well, ironically, my answer probably is by hiding in his basement. Because with Joe Biden and Donald Trump, both at the time and now, they are both very unliked. And I mean, while Trump has a very enthusiastic base, he's also the most polarizing presidential candidate ever. And I wrote a piece about this for Real Clear Politics a while ago, how the double haters will decide the election. And what I mean is that those people who disapprove and have a negative opinion about both highly likely swing voters, highly likely people somewhere in the middle. Those double haters are likely to decide the election. So, ironically, I think that if the attention is on Trump, Biden will win. If the attention is on Biden, Trump will win.
Hmm.
And that's exactly the dynamics that we had last time around
Hmm.
when he was the incumbent. The focus was on him. There was a pandemic, so Biden disappeared in Delaware, and that actually really worked in his favor.
Yeah, and you mentioned the pandemic. It certainly affected the way the candidates were able to campaign, both Donald Trump and Joe Biden. You mentioned Biden did not hit the campaign trail all that often. We're seeing a similar campaign strategy here for Joe Biden in 2024. Looking at another situation where you had a challenger defeat an incumbent, going back to Bill Clinton taking down George H.W. Bush. Again, George H.W. Bush at the beginning of his first term, very popular because of the Gulf War. His numbers were through the roof, but of course, economic recessions and downturns towards the end of his first term really ate away at his popularity. How did Bill Clinton take advantage of that and flip the script on President Bush at that time?
Yeah, it's actually a great and quite classic example of how challengers should run. First of all, by again owning change, having a message that is based on the economy, which almost always is the dominating issue. And
Hmm.
he was really able to take and own the issue of the economy versus Bush and put Bush on the defense.
Hmm.
And then another component that I think that Clinton did very well at the time was to counterbalance his call for change by making swing voters comfortable with voting for change.
Hmm.
In other words, and I have a whole chapter about this in the book, you need to offer the right amount of change in the right tone so that swing voters are comfortable voting for it, because change may be nice and sound good, but it's also something that is frightening people. And then lastly, I think the candidates do matter. I think Bill Clinton at the time was really, and same with Barack Obama, for example, were just really great communicators. And
Hmm.
that's another chapter I have in the book, is like, if you're not naturally gifted, at least work on your campaign skills and improve your campaign skills.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that was also one of the reasons, if I'm looking back even further, you look at Ronald Reagan going up against Jimmy Carter. Now, Jimmy Carter had a number of issues that he had to overcome. The Iran hostage situation. Again, you had another economic downturn in the late 1970s. And here you had Ronald Reagan, who is a phenomenal speaker, bringing a message of change. And this time it was a Republican challenger against a Democratic incumbent. These last few times when incumbents have been taken down, they were Republican presidents. But in this particular case in 1980, you had Ronald Reagan take down Jimmy Carter, a Republican defeating an incumbent Democrat. What did Ronald Reagan do? Again, change, I assume, is at the center. Anytime you want to take down an incumbent, it almost has to be based around change. Am I right?
Yes, and Reagan really expressed this change hypothesis, the referenda hypothesis, very, very well. I'm sure you remember saying, "Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?"
Mm-hmm.
And I think this really expresses this referenda on the incumbent idea that really has inspired challengers around the world ever since. And absolutely, I think challengers from the right actually win with the same recipe as challengers from the left. So when I wrote the book, I actually tried to make it fair and balanced in
Mm-hmm.
that sense, that it's really applicable. It's like a step-by-step guide that is applicable both for challengers on the left, challengers on the right, and at all levels of government, and even internationally, because I think while we cannot copy-paste things, we can get a lot of inspiration from campaigns around the globe.
Well, there's a lot of psychology that goes into this too, right? I mean, there's the psychology of the voter, where the voter is based on what's happening in the world around them, being able to target and identify certain subsections of voters, and knowing how hard to go at your base voters, how really cultivate that strong base, and how to reach out to independents. What type of independents do you reach out to? Suburban moms? Do you reach out to military families? All that kind of stuff, that all plays into it. And like you said, the psychology, it might be different in other countries, but the psychology plays a big role in trying to find out where are the vulnerabilities in my opponent, and how can I go about making inroads into those areas.
Absolutely, and I think the while the issues are different, while the tools are different, and while the media environment in which campaigns take place obviously are different and fast evolving, the basics of electoral strategy actually have not changed and
Mhm.
will never change. You need a message, you need a targeting plan, and then you need a lot of discipline to carry out that plan and stick to it.
Now, you also talk about how to showcase a successful record at the local and state level to show voters that you have had a track record previously to this higher office that you're now seeking. How do they go about doing that?
That is part of what I mentioned before, is making people comfortable with voting for
Hmm.
change.
Mm.
And that's why, for example, governors have traditionally been very successful at the presidential level in the US. If you think back, Jimmy Carter was a governor, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, so George Bush. So, and it's because they can see, look, this is what I've done in my area. It's not just words, it's not just a promise, and it's not, in that sense, also neither is it a revolution or a change of values. It's really a change in the sense of an improvement. And I've done it. You can look at the results. And
Mhm.
I think that's why the local record can be an important part of this strategy of making voters comfortable with voting for change.
And one of the examples that you mentioned in this book is Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, how he was able, as a first-time candidate, to win essentially a landslide victory. Can you talk a little bit more about that? How he was able to pull that off?
Yes, it's a fascinating case because he was really the absolute outsider, right? He
Hmm.
was actually a comedian, and the first office he ever ran for was for the presidency. And I think what makes the case so fascinating is that he didn't apologize for being an outsider, he didn't even try to neutralize his disadvantages. He really doubled down on his status of an outsider.
Mm.
So, for example, he didn't have a platform, he didn't have a political ideology, and didn't try to hastily come up with one. Instead, he turned the table around and he said, you know what? Politicians usually always promise you the sky and the moon. This time, we're going to do it differently. Tell me what you want me to do, and I'll try to deliver my best.
Mhm.
So, just one example of turning a possible weakness into a strength. And for example, when he started to become a threat in the surveys and he was seen, obviously became a target, and he was bombarded with attacks, again, he used his status and turned things around. He made a competition.
Mm.
He asked his followers on Instagram to send in the most ridiculous accusations about him, which is really a brilliant way of dealing with all the accusations together. Maybe there was an accusation that would have been something actually worth to justify, right? Who
Yeah.
knows? But by dealing with all of them together and making a competition out of it, where people send in the most ridiculous claims, it was really a brilliant move that, as a comedian, he was very well positioned to do.
One of the other things I wanted to ask you about is politicians being able to engage in untraditional alliances, right? Being able to find new partners where maybe you wouldn't have looked in those particular places before. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, it's actually an idea that I had from the cases I write about in developing countries. So I write, for example, about Brazil. I've done myself a lot of work in Southeast Asia, and people there are really, how to say this, ideologically flexible in engaging in new alliances. And I think there's a lot to learn for us because in our part of the world, it's even become a bit the opposite, where
Mhm.
actually reaching out has become quite unfashionable. And I think if you, especially in a system where you need a majority, you need to build coalitions. You
Hmm.
need to reach out. And I think we can get inspiration from them.
Yeah, you see, even within the parties right now, there's sometimes you're demonized if you're working even with someone else in your own party who doesn't believe a certain thing. The split between the MAGA Trump Republicans and the so-called rhinos, the Republicans who are more willing to work with Democrats across the aisle. That those fractures right now in the United States seem to make it impossible to get anything done.
Absolutely. And again, I think Ronald Reagan is a great example because nobody would doubt that he had core convictions. But remember, after actually quite a competitive primary in 1980, he put his primary opponent, George Herbert Walker Bush, on the ticket.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think it's actually a very good move because guess what? Divided parties rarely win great general election victories.
And that's fair. And we're going to see how this all plays out over the next few months. But one last thing to kind of wrap things up. You talked a little bit about what Donald Trump here can do to unseat President Biden, the incumbent. As the incumbent, what should President Biden be doing right now to hold on to the Oval Office?
Make this a binary choice instead of a referenda about him. I mean, he still has a little bit of time. He can try to sell his record. And who knows, maybe by November, the economy will be different and people will feel the Bidenomics. But absent all of this, I think he is left with the ruthless counter-offense, the way George Bush won re-election, the way Barack Obama won re-election. And it's really to say, you may not like what you have, but don't risk it because what the alternative would be way worse. And here is why. And so we're back to the double haters. And I think strategically for Biden, as time progresses, that will be his ticket. And it's quite revealing to me that actually he explicitly runs against Trump and against MAGA Republicans. And that's exactly why.
Well, as I mentioned the title of your book, once again, please hold it up so people can see what it looks like. It's called Beat the Incumbent, Proven Strategies and Tactics to Win Elections. Dr. Luis Perron, thank you so much for your time and your expertise. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.